Title: The $160 M Mirror Monster. Why this Chinese megatower is tearing itself apart. Roll. Hyperlapse of a massive Chinese metropolitan skyline. Slow zoom into a sleek, razor-sharp, blue-mirrored skyscraper that completely dominates the surrounding historic architecture. Sudden harsh sound effect. The screech of tearing metal and shattering glass. Narrator: VO. Imagine a $160 million luxury mega project. The tallest architectural crown jewel in the entire regional skyline, designed by one of the most celebrated engineering minds on Earth. Now imagine that same tower suddenly turning on its own city and throwing 500-pound sheets of mirrored glass onto the sidewalks below, not cracking, not leaking. Falling quarter-ton panels of tempered glass, tearing loose from 60 stories up, accelerating to terminal velocity, and exploding into lethal shards on the crowded streets of a major Chinese financial district. And the falling glass wasn't even the worst part. The truly terrifying part is what structural forensic engineers quietly discovered while trying to make it stop. Graphic. Title card hits the screen with an aggressive industrial thud. Text: The Shattered Empire, inside the Mirror Monster. Narrator: VO. This is not a story about a few broken windows. This is a case study of structural engineering, pushed to the absolute brink of disaster. This is a story about an iconic mega project that was supposed to cost 500 million CNY, but finished at an astronomical 1.15 billion CNY, more than double its original budget, and 5 agonizing years behind schedule. A vertical monument wrapped in 10,344 custom-engineered panes of insulated glass, each single unit weighing as much as an industrial refrigerator, hung up to 240 meters over a teeming public transit hub for 4 straight years. The Municipal Construction Commission and local traffic police had to completely cordon off the multi-lane avenues surrounding the tower every single time the coastal wind gusts hit 72 kilometers per hour. Why? Because absolutely no one could promise that the building's skin would stay attached to its skeleton. Sit with that data point for a moment. A finished, award-winning architectural masterpiece that pedestrians had to be physically, legally protected from by riot police and construction barriers. 10,000 panes, 500 pounds each. Entire city blocks evacuated when the wind picked up. Behind every single one of those metrics sat a quiet, desperate panic that the developers could not address out loud. Why was their structural crown jewel tearing itself to pieces? B-roll. Historical archival footage of rapid Chinese urban development, heavy machinery digging massive foundations into deep mud near a major riverbank, transitioning to slick 3D structural wireframes of a modern skyscraper. Narrator: VO. It started as pure, unadulterated corporate ambition. The year was 2018. A massive domestic conglomerate decided it wanted a statement piece. The tallest, most radical tower in the provincial capital, planted directly in the heart of a prestigious, historic lakefront district. Just a few blocks away, a rival tech giant had recently completed its own massive concrete headquarters. And this developer wanted something that would make that look like a cheap warm-up act. They hired a legendary international design institute led by visionary chief architect, lead designer Chen. And Chen wasn't interested in just building a standard concrete box. He wanted to build something that almost wasn't there. He wanted to achieve the holy grail of modern architecture, a flawless, invisible skin of deep blue mirrored glass, a surface so smooth, so utterly devoid of visible support frames that the massive skyscraper would literally dissolve into the haze of the sky, reflecting only the ancient temples and low-rise neighborhoods surrounding it. To pull off this radical aesthetic illusion, Chen made engineering choices that had never been tested at this scale. Each structural bay was designed as a single, uninterrupted pane of glass, with virtually no heavy exterior mullions to break up the surface. Then, he took a standard rectangular floor plan and warped it into a sharp, aggressive parallelogram, sharpening 2 of the corners until the entire 240-meter concrete slab looked like a razor blade standing on point.image. Architectural render showing the sharp corners of the tower slicing through the skyline, highly reflective blue tint catching the morning sun. Narrator: VO. If architectural critics hailed it as a triumph, they called it the exact moment modern engineering finally delivered the seamless glass curtain wall, the world had been chasing for half a century. But the local population wasn't thrilled. Long before the first pane ever fell, local residents and urban preservationists actively protested the project, dropping a 60-story reflective monolith directly beside a beloved, centuries-old historic pagoda struck many as an act of corporate arrogance, a glass giant elbowing its way into the city's most sacred cultural address. And underneath the aesthetic outrage lay a much deeper, purely practical fear. This historic district is not built on solid bedrock. It sits entirely on soft, shifting alluvial soil, a high-water table marshland composed of centuries of river silt. It is exactly the kind of treacherous, waterlogged ground that makes foundation engineers incredibly nervous about anything this heavy. By the time construction reached the halfway mark in late 2020, rumors were already ripping through local real estate forums that the massive tower was unevenly settling into the mud. Rumors that the developer rushed to aggressively deny through corporate press releases. The flawless glass skin, they claimed, was a masterpiece of modern tech. But that skin was about to become a public safety nightmare, because the glass wasn't ordinary glass, and the environment was about to expose a fatal flaw baked directly into the factory line. Roll close-up macro shots of glass fracturing under extreme laboratory pressure. Animated 3D cross-section showing heat radiating into a double-paned window assembly. Narrator VI. To understand why this billion-yuan tower started shedding its skin like a dying beast, you have to look past the beautiful blueprints and dive straight into the molecular engineering of the glass itself. This wasn't off-the-shelf window material. To survive the punishing wind pressures of a high-altitude urban environment, the developer utilized specialized double-paned insulating glass units. The manufacturer, a massive industrial glass supplier based in northern China, marketed this specific line as the absolute pinnacle of structural glazing technology. On paper, it was a thermal masterpiece. Each massive window was an independent sandwich composed of two heavy sheets of glass separated by a factory-sealed pocket of air, with a microscopic metallic reflective coating bonded to the inside of the outer pane to deflect solar heat. In theory, it was designed to maximize insulation while giving chief architect Chen his seamless, sky-vanishing mirror effect. In reality, these thousands of sealed units contained a hidden, silent defect that absolutely no site inspector caught in time. Let's break down the engineering in plain language. Graphic, a clean, highly detailed engineering diagram demonstrating the debris cycle of high-rise glass. Arrows show expansion under intense sunlight and contraction during rapid temperature drops. Narrator, VO. Every single day, a skyscraper undergoes an immense thermal cycle. When the relentless midday sun hits the blue-tinted exterior of the tower, the air trapped inside that sealed pocket between the two panes expands rapidly. The pressure builds up from the inside out. When night falls and temperatures plunge, the air contracts, drawing the glass inward. Standard high-rise windows are designed to flex smoothly to absorb this constant daily breathing cycle. But on this tower, the specialized bond holding the internal reflective coating directly to the glass was far too rigid. It lacked the necessary elastomeric flexibility. Instead of cushioning the immense pressure changes, this hyper-stiff chemical bond did something catastrophic. It transmitted the entire thermal stress load directly into the outer pane of glass. Over and over. Every hot summer day, every freezing winter night, engineers call this localized thermal stress fatigue. In slow motion, across all 10,344 bays of the skyscraper, the outer glass was literally being flexed to death from the inside out before a single office worker ever moved into the building. B-roll. Time-lapse transitions from clear blue skies to an aggressive dark storm front rolling over a dense Chinese megacity. Dramatic sound effects of howling gale force winds. Narrator, VO. The warning signs started showing up as early as mid-2021, while the structural core was still being finalized. Site supervisors noticed isolated cracks appearing in random glass panels on the upper tiers. At first, the project management team brushed it off as standard construction anomalies, perhaps a loose crane hook or minor handling errors during installation. It was easy to wave off as a statistical fluke when you're managing a mega project of this scale. Then came the night of December 14, 2021. A brutal winter gale ripped straight through the high-rise corridor of the city, with specialized anemometers recording wind gusts hitting a violent 110 kilometers per hour at the 50th floor and above. Under the immense external wind pressure combined with the internal thermal fatigue, the tower's engineering limits simply crossed the point of no return. The building started shedding. Graphic 3D physics simulation showing a 500-pound pane tearing free from a high-rise, falling edge first, and striking multiple panels below, triggering an exponential cascading failure. Narrator VO. It was absolute carnage 60 stories up. Massive, 500-pound panels broke completely free from their structural silicone anchor points. As they detached, they didn't just fall flat. They plummeted edge first like massive mirrored guillotines, slicing straight through the delicate glass panels directly beneath them on their way down. Those impacted panels shattered instantly, releasing their own heavy shards, which then picked up speed and smashed into the floors below them. It was an uncontrolled, vertical chain reaction, echoing down the face of a 240-meter monolith. By the time the morning sun rose over the district, dozens of multi-story voids marred the beautiful blue reflection of the tower. In the chaotic months that followed, the official count of spontaneously failing or fallen panels climbed past 85. The local municipal housing bureau realized they were staring at an unprecedented public safety crisis right in the middle of a high-density zone. By March of 2022, the developer was forced to take a humiliating, desperate measures. More than an acre of the tower's ultra-modern, cutting-edge glass facade was systematically stripped and boarded over with crude sheets of heavy black-painted exterior plywood. B-roll. Slow-panning shots of a modern skyscraper bizarrely covered in random patches of dark plywood boards. Pedestrians looking up in confusion behind heavy construction netting. Narrator V. The regional, financial hub's proudest new architectural masterpiece had just earned a humiliating new local nickname among citizens, the Plywood Palace. And the danger didn't stop when the winter winds died down. The underlying molecular defect meant that glass panels were continuing to fracture by the thousands, completely independent of the weather. Internal microcracks were spiderwebbing through the structural units day and night. The local traffic police and fire rescue teams couldn't take any more chances. They set up permanent checkpoints, deploying heavy metal barricades to completely seal off the surrounding multi-lane boulevards and the entrance to the integrated metro station. Every single time local weather stations projected wind gusts over 45 kilometers per hour. One of the most valuable, heavily trafficked commercial squares in the entire metropolitan area became an immediate, hazardous no-go zone the moment the weather turned ugly. A building explicitly engineered by designer Chen to gracefully disappear into the sky had instead transformed into an impossible-to-ignore multi-ton liability. Officially, the developer maintained absolute radio silence. The public watched in real time as a multi-billion yuan landmark devolved into a boarded-up, roped-off hazard, while the elite parties involved stayed completely quiet about who was actually footing the bill. Behind closed doors, however, an intense, multi-party legal warfare was already erupting. Was it an inherent flaw in Chen's architectural design? Was it a failure of the general contractor's high-altitude installation methods? Or was it an internal manufacturing defect from the northern glass supplier? Each corporate entity had millions of yuan at stake and every reason to point the finger elsewhere. For months, that bitter conflict stayed buried deep inside private arbitration offices and municipal bureau files rather than spilling into state media. On the outside, the massive tower just sat there, half shimmering glass mirror, half raw rotting plywood. A massive, 9-figure question mark dominating the city skyline. But here is the terrifying detail that the Municipal Construction Commission didn't dare leak to the public at the time. While specialized forensic teams were frantically chasing the falling glass, a completely separate, elite team of structural analysts ran the tower's entire physical profile through an advanced wind tunnel testing facility at the China Academy of Building Research. And what they discovered under that simulated high-velocity air pressure wasn't about the windows at all. It was something infinitely worse. It was a revelation that questioned whether the entire 60-story concrete mass could even stay upright. B-roll, high-end wind tunnel laboratory facility. A precise scale model of the parallelogram tower is subjected to high-velocity smoke streams. Structural stress testing software flashes red across a grid map of a Chinese megacity. Narrator VO. When a skyscraper starts shedding hundreds of tons of glass onto a major Chinese metropolitan center, your immediate instinct is to look at the brackets, the silicon, and the window frames. That is exactly what the public, the local media, and the Municipal Housing Bureau were doing. They were looking at the surface. But inside the highly classified testing labs of the China Academy of Building Research, structural engineers were looking at something much deeper. They were looking at the skeleton, and what they found sent a shockwave through the engineering team. Because this iconic tower didn't just have a facade problem. It had a profound, systemic aerodynamic crisis. To fully grasp the scale of the danger, you have to look at how this failure fits into the broader context of high-rise engineering across China's rapidly evolving skylines. This wasn't an isolated incident of poor craftsmanship. It was a symptom of a highly aggressive era of architectural ambition. Graphic. A comparative map showcasing iconic Chinese high-rise structures, comparing standard aerodynamic designs like the Shanghai Towers, twist to the sharp, unyielding corners of the mirror monster. Narrator VO. Look at the most successful super-tall structures across the country. The 632-meter Shanghai Tower famously twists 120 degrees as it rises. That isn't just an aesthetic gimmick. It is a critical aerodynamic calculation designed to reduce wind loads by a massive 24%. The Ping and Finance Center in Shenzhen utilizes a highly tapered, aerodynamic apex to slice through typhoon force currents. But our 240-meter mirror monster did the exact opposite. Chief Architect Chen had taken a dense, massive concrete core and wrapped it in a hyper-sharp, unyielding parallelogram floor plan. He sharpened two of the tower's opposing corners into razor-thin points to achieve that dramatic, knife-edge visual effect. When the fierce, seasonal coastal winds or sudden continental gales slammed into those unyielding, sharp glass corners, the air couldn't flow smoothly around the structure. Instead, it detached violently, creating massive, low-pressure vortex zones on the leeward side of the building. Engineers call this phenomenon vortex shedding. As these massive pockets of low-pressure air alternate from one side of the skyscraper to the other, they exert a powerful, rhythmic, sideways aerodynamic force. In plain terms, the wind was treating this multi-billion yuan tower like a massive tuning fork. Roll. Interior office footage showing water sloshing back and forth in a cup on a desk. Close-up of mechanical hanging fixtures gently swaying inside an upper-floor boardroom. Narrator. V-off long before the public ever saw a single sheet of plywood go up. Elite tenants on the top 10 floors were already experiencing the terrifying reality of this aerodynamic miscalculation. On high wind days, office workers reported intense, nauseating motion sickness. Desk lamps would sway. Water inside office coolers would visibly slosh from side to side. The building was experiencing an excessive lateral drift. A slow, sweeping wobble that left human inner ears completely disoriented. The initial theory floating around the developer's internal engineering board was straightforward. They assumed the tower's excessive, unmitigated swaying was creating immense structural distortion across the concrete frame, and that twisting action was physically popping the ridged glass windows out of their tracks. To arrest this stomach-churning movement, the developer brought in the absolute heavyweights of domestic structural engineering. They fast-tracked the installation of a massive state-of-the-art dual-tuned mass damper system near the 58th floor. Graphic. 3D CAD model demonstrating the operation of a tuned mass damper. A massive 300-ton steel block counteracting the lateral movement of a skyscraper during high wind loads. Narrator. V. This system is an engineering marvel. It consists of two massive steel weights, each tipping the scales at roughly 300 tons, suspended inside the upper core of the tower. These massive blocks float on a microscopic, pressurized film of hydraulic oil and are bound to the building's skeleton by high-performance computer-controlled actuators. The physics are beautifully simple. When a violent wind gust hits the tower and forces it to lean to the left, the internal computer systems instantly command the 300-ton steel blocks to slide to the right. By moving counter to the building's natural sway, the dampers effectively cancel out the kinetic energy of the wind before the human beings inside can ever perceive the motion. It was one of the most advanced structural damping systems ever deployed in the province, and it performed flawlessly. The interior motion sickness vanished. The corporate executives could finally sit in their top-floor boardrooms without losing their balance. But there was a devastating catch. While the 600 tons of shifting steel beautifully resolved the interior occupant comfort problem, the independent forensic investigation, spearheaded by the Regional Construction Commission, concluded that the damper system did absolutely nothing to solve the falling glass crisis, because the wind tunnel analysis and physical laboratory teardowns proved that the curtain wall failure had nothing to do with the tower's lateral sway. The two disasters were completely independent of one another, happening simultaneously on the exact same structure. The stiff, defective factory bond on the 10,344 insulating glass units was still actively fracturing the outer panes under daily thermal stress, regardless of whether the building stood perfectly still or drifted in the wind. The structural masterpiece had two distinct, potentially lethal engineering oversights baked into its DNA from day one. B-roll, slow-motion panning shots across a grid of cracked glass, transitioning to heavy excavation machinery reinforcing a deep foundation wall. Narrator, VOVFO. And this exposes the darkest, most uncomfortable truth about accountability in the high-density construction sector of that era. At the time the project was approved, the local building codes simply didn't require full-scale, long-term environmental fatigue testing for integrated double-paned units under the extreme, multi-variable punishment of a coastal skyscraper environment. The glass panels had technically passed every existing static laboratory pressure standard required by law. The regulatory standards simply weren't asking the right questions. It took thousands of 500-pound sheets of glass, fracturing over an active public transport court square, to prove to the entire industry that the safety tests everyone blindly trusted were fundamentally incomplete. The mirror monster had effectively weaponized its own cutting-edge design, turning a major metropolitan hub into a real-time high-stakes physics experiment. And as the corporate entities continued to stall, the municipal authorities realized they were running out of time before a catastrophic failure claimed human lives. B-roll, high-angle drone footage looking down over a heavily restricted commercial zone. Uniformed municipal traffic police deploying high-visibility metal barriers to block multi-lane intersections. Thick construction netting hanging loosely from the upper tiers of a blue glass skyscraper. Narrator, V. When you look at a multi-billion yuan engineering disaster purely through the lens of data, load calculations, and structural physics, it is easy to forget the human cost. It is easy to treat it as a sterile case study in a textbook. But on the ground in this booming provincial capital, the reality of the mirror monster was anything but abstract. For the tens of thousands of everyday citizens who lived, worked, and commuted through this dense historic lakeside district, the tower had transformed from a glittering symbol of regional pride into an active, unpredictable combat zone. Let's talk about what it actually feels like to live underneath an engineering failure of this magnitude. Image, a series of highly detailed, realistic localized maps showing the proximity of the 240-meter tower to a bustling multi-line metro interchange, a crowded lakeside promenade, and historic low-rise residential alleys. Narrator. Consider the daily routine of a local resident. Let's call him Li Wei. Li is an IT specialist who lived just 3 blocks away in a traditional, low-rise neighborhood bordering the historic lakefront. Every single morning, Li would walk out of his apartment, navigate the narrow stone alleys of his district, and head straight toward the major integrated subway interchange located directly beneath the footprint of the new glass Megatower. But by early 2022, that simple commute had become a high-stakes gamble. Whenever the morning weather forecast predicted seasonal coastal wind gusts climbing past 45 kilometers per hour, the entire neighborhood would be awakened not by alarm clocks, but by the blaring megaphones of the local fire rescue teams and municipal traffic police. The commands were urgent, authoritative, and unyielding. Clear the sidewalks. Evacuate the public square. Do not look up. Roll. Nighttime archival footage of heavy rain and wind lashing against dark high-rise structures. Handheld camera footage showing emergency vehicles flashing red and blue lights across wet pavement filled with shattered glass debris. Narrator. VOI. Imagine one of the busiest, most commercially vital transport hubs in the entire metropolitan area. A plaza that moves over 100,000 commuters every single day, suddenly turned into a ghost town. Local authorities took absolutely no chances. They deployed heavy, interlocking steel riot barriers across a 2-block radius. The wide, multi-lane boulevards that fed traffic into the financial district were completely choked off, diverted away from the shadow of the skyscraper. If you were a small business owner, a restaurant manager, a convenience store operator, or a boutique owner located across the street from the tower, your livelihood was instantly paralyzed. Doors had to be locked. Windows had to be taped over. Customers were physically barred from entering the zone by uniformed officers. The economic damage to the local surrounding community was bleeding out at an estimated millions of yuan for every single day the streets were locked down, and the physical debris left behind after a high-wind event looked less like a construction dell, and more like an industrial explosion graphic. A detailed physics and mass velocity breakdown. A 250-kilogram, 500-pound glass pane is tracked from the 55th floor, 180 meters up, down to the pavement. Text on screen displays kinetic energy output, impact force, and terminal velocity statistics. Orator, VO. Let's look at the terrifying mechanical numbers behind a falling panel. A single insulating glass unit on Chief Architect Chen's masterpiece weighed approximately 250 kilograms, exactly 550 pounds. That is the equivalent weight of a large commercial vending machine or an industrial refrigerator. Now, take that mass and drop it from the 55th floor, roughly 180 meters in the air. By the time that 550-pound slab of mirrored glass completes its freefall, gravity has accelerated it to a terminal velocity exceeding 160 kilometers per hour. When it impacts the solid granite pavement of the public square, it doesn't just fracture. It releases a catastrophic kinetic energy output that completely obliterates the glass structure, converting it into an explosive wave of razor-sharp, high-velocity shrapnel. These heavy fragments didn't just lay flat on the street. They bounded off the concrete, piercing through aluminum storefront signs, slicing through the canvas awnings of neighboring buildings, and embedding themselves deep into the asphalt. A single direct impact from one of these falling panels wouldn't just be fatal, it would completely vaporize anything beneath it. During the great winter gale of December 2021, when the building shed over 60 panels in a single night, the scene at daybreak was horrifying. The public square was covered in a thick, glittering blanket of blue glass shards that crunched under the boots of emergency workers. The roofs of several parked transit buses had been sliced completely open as if by a giant blade. It was a miracle of pure chance and aggressive police intervention that no pedestrians were caught in the crossfire during those initial chaotic drops. B-roll, slow-motion close-ups of construction workers clad in heavy safety harnesses, operating high-altitude window-washing cradles under overcast skies, heavy industrial suction cups gripping massive glass sheets. Narrator, VO. Inside the tower, the psychological toll on the few maintenance crews and structural inspectors tasked with stabilizing the building was immense. Imagine being an engineer, let's call her Zhang Min, hired by a forensic firm to systematically inspect the integrity of the remaining 10,000 panes. Zhang and her team had to step into high-altitude window-washing cradles, suspended by steel cables hundreds of meters over the city, knowing that the very glass units they were inspecting were actively under immense internal thermal stress. Every time the sun hit a panel or a cold front rolled in, the internal chemistry of that defective factory bond could trigger a spontaneous fracture right in front of their faces. They were essentially walking across a vertical minefield, tapping on 550-pound bombs wrapped in blue mirror tint, By October of 2022, the Municipal Construction Commission realized that the developer's stopgap solution, covering the failed sections with crude, black-painted plywood, was completely unsustainable. The Plywood Palace had become an international laughingstock, a viral punchline across domestic social media platforms that threatened the reputation of the city's entire modernization drive. More importantly, the plywood itself was vulnerable to rotting under the intense humidity of the local climate, creating a secondary hazard of falling timber. The ultimate verdict handed down by the high-level expert panel was swift, brutal, and historic. There would be no localized patching. There would be no minor repairs. Graphic, an animated architectural sequence showing the complete systematic removal of all 10,344 blue mirrored glass units from the skyscraper frame, replaced piece by thick, single-pane tempered structural glass. Narrator, V. The developer was forced to announce a total radical remediation plan. Every single one of the 10,344 custom glass windows would be completely torn out of the structural skeleton and discarded. Every single pane. This time, the engineering team completely abandoned the multi-layered, double-paned insulating design that had failed so spectacularly at the factory level. Instead, they opted for an incredibly thick, single-pane, heavy-duty tempered monolithic glass. This type of glass is specifically engineered to undergo high-intensity heat treatments during manufacturing, ensuring that if it ever does fail under extreme mechanical loads, it doesn't shear into massive, razor-sharp guillotines. Instead, it fractures into millions of tiny blunt, pebble-like fragments that present a fraction of the danger to human life below. But the sheer logistical scale of this high-altitude replacement project was unprecedented in the province's construction history. The entire 240-meter skyscraper had to be treated like an active, hazardous heavy industrial site for over 3 consecutive years. Specialized heavy-duty scaffolding and massive safety catch nets had to be anchored into the concrete core, wrapping the top half of the tower in a giant industrial cocoon. B-roll. Panning shots of heavy machinery, moving giant crates of replacement glass through a tightly guarded construction staging area. Time-lapse of the tower's appearance slowly transforming as the plywood is systematically replaced. Narrator. VE5. The direct cost for the reglazing project alone was astronomical, draining an estimated 40 to 60 million CNY in raw materials and specialized high-altitude labor. And that doesn't account for the compounding financial bleeding of the delayed occupancy. The grand opening of this luxury landmark, originally scheduled to welcome elite corporate tenants and high-end retail venues in late 2020, was aggressively pushed back all the way to 2025 for 5 years. A billion-yuan asset sat completely hollow, a vertical ghost tower wrapped in nets, steel ropes, and rotting wood, while the surrounding district suffered through endless traffic diversions and sudden pedestrian bans. The project that was meant to solidify lead designer Chen's place in architectural history had instead become a multi-year masterclass in crisis management, corporate liability, and public terror. And yet, as the massive crane slowly began the grueling process of replacing the 10,000 windows, the elite legal teams representing the developer, the general contractor, and the northern glass supplier were about to find out that the accounting for this disaster would take just as long to clear as the streets below. Roll. Slow, majestic drone flight over the fully restored, gleaming blue-mirrored tower at dusk. The lights of the vibrant commercial district sparkle below. Transition to a stark, brightly lit corporate boardroom with a large conference table. Narrator. When a multi-billion yuan landmark turns into a public hazard in full view of an entire metropolitan area, the ultimate reckoning doesn't happen on the scaffolding. It happens behind closed doors, where the sheer financial weight of an engineering failure is finally tallied up. In late 2024, the developer completely stopped waiting for corporate apologies or mutual agreements. They launched a massive, sweeping legal action, filing comprehensive claims against 6 separate major entities involved in the design and execution of the tower. The list of defendants read like an elite roster of the domestic construction industry. Chief architect Chen's prestigious Design Institute, the massive state-backed General Contracting Corporation, the specialized high-rise curtain wall engineering firm, the industrial glass supplier from northern China, and the major state-owned insurance firms that had bonded the structural work. The total damages claimed by the developer were staggering, topping out at over 600 million CNY. Graphic, a balance sheet breakdown displaying the legal claims, 80 million CNY for the total high-altitude glass replacement, and over 520 million CNY in monumental consequential losses, including extended vacancy penalties and brand damager. VO. The direct cost of ripping out and replacing those 10,344 defective windows was just a fraction of the financial carnage. The real bleeding came from the consequential losses, specifically, a massive penalty claim for the 33 long months, where the primary office tower and the high-end retail podium sat completely vacant, wrapped in heavy construction netting. Completely unusable, the legal warfare dragged on through rigorous arbitration and closed-door expert panels for nearly 3 years. Ultimately, the parties reached an intensive out-of-court settlement, reported to be around 200 million CNY. But in keeping with the highly sensitive nature of high-stakes domestic commerce, all 6 entities immediately signed strict, ironclad non-disclosure agreements. No single firm stood up on the record to admit fault. No corporate executive held a press conference to explain to the citizens of the province exactly who had failed and how. The streets had been shut down in full view of millions, but the final corporate accounting was quietly buried inside a sealed filing cabinet. B-roll. Dramatic pan across the ornate stone carvings and sweeping tiled roofs of a beautifully preserved historic pagoda, framed sharply against the sheer modern glass wall of the adjacent tower. Narrator. VO. But the developers' legal battles didn't stop with the glass suppliers. The most tragic collateral damage of this aggressive project belonged to the tower's oldest neighbor, the centuries-old historic pagoda standing right beside the site. During the initial high-speed excavation phase back in 2019, the general contractor had aggressively pumped millions of gallons of water out of the waterlogged alluvial soil to pour the skyscraper's massive concrete foundation mat. But that massive dewatering process did something catastrophic to the surrounding environment. It destabilized the water table beneath the ancient pagoda. As the water vanished from the soil, the wet earth dried out, shifted, and compacted unevenly. Structural engineers call this differential settlement, a nightmare scenario where one side of a historic building sinks deeper into the earth than the other, creating immense internal twisting forces that slowly rip ancient masonry and timber apart. The Cultural Relics Preservation Bureau launched an immediate investigation, discovering deep structural fractures spreading through the historic pagoda's foundations. The developer was legally compelled to pay a massive 80 million CNY settlement, specifically dedicated to an elite, multi-year structural underpinning and restoration project to save the ancient landmark from collapsing. For a mega project that prided itself on gracefully reflecting the city's history, the mirror monster had come perilously close to destroying it forever. B-roll, low-angle shot looking straight up the sharp, razor-like edge of the parallelogram skyscraper as clouds race across its pristine, restored glass surface. Narrator. Today, the 240-meter tower still stands proudly in the heart of the district, now known simply by its prominent municipal street address. The new, heavy single-pane tempered glass has held beautifully for the last year, without a single spontaneous fracture. The massive 300-ton Tune mass dampers still slide smoothly on their pressurized film of oil 60 stories up, quietly neutralizing the fierce coastal winds. The bustling public transport plaza below is fully open, filled with thousands of daily commuters who walk past the building without a care in the world. It is now widely celebrated as a triumph of modern urban revitalization, but its survival rests entirely on a terrifying secret that the vast majority of pedestrians walking past it have never heard about. Because the falling glass that paralyzed this city for years, it was never the true threat. It was a spectacular high-visibility distraction from a much deeper, potentially fatal structural crisis. Graphic. A wireframe structural model of the tower under extreme wind simulation. The model twists violently along its vertical axis, demonstrating structural failure at the core before 1,500 tons of diagonal steel bracing are highlighted in bright orange. Narrator, VO. Remember the wind tunnel tests conducted by the China Academy of Building Research? When the forensic structural team analyzed Chief Architect Chen's sharp, razor-cornered parallelogram design, they discovered a flaw that had absolutely nothing to do with window panes or factory bonds. Under a severe, once-in-a-century gale or a localized typhoon strike, the intense vortex shedding created by those sharp corners wouldn't just cause the tower to sway side to side. The aerodynamic forces would actually cause the entire 60-story concrete mass to violently twist along its vertical axis. In the worst-case scenario, the wind pressure would exceed the shear capacity of the structural core, causing the entire skyscraper to catastrophically overturn and topple into the surrounding high-density district. Not sway, overturn. The danger was so immediate and so terrifying that the Municipal Commission brought in the country's leading authorities on tall steel structures to quietly formulate a desperate fix. While the public, the media, and social forums were completely obsessed with arguing over the plywood and the falling glass, teams of structural welders were quietly working deep inside the building's core. They retrofitted and welded roughly 1,500 tons of massive, heavy diagonal structural steel, bracing directly into the central columns of the tower to stop it from falling over. The spectacular failure everyone laughed at was a visual shield for a structural crisis that could have flattened a city block. The local population spent years mocking a boarded-up tower, completely unaware that the building was secretly being saved from total catastrophic collapse behind that very same plywood. The Mirror Monster teaches us a chilling lesson about the modern built environment. The engineering failures you can actually see are almost never the ones that should truly terrify you. An entire city watched the glass and completely missed the steel. So, look up at the modern skyline in your own city tonight and ask yourself the real question: how many massive, glittering glass towers do you walk past every single